Welcome to yet another episode of Beyond the Present podcast. My name is Daniel Morgan. I'm here joined by Poujix, live from Toronto. Hey there, Poujix, man. How's it going?
Everything's great. Life is awesome. Weather is a little bit hot here nowadays, but we'll live through it.
Awesome. Oh, yeah. Fantastic. And yes, that's right. That's the guy, the one guy. Ishaan Goel is back for yet another episode. Hey, Ishaan, how's it going?
Hey, guys. Glad to be back again.
It is a pleasure to have you with us. My Mr. Man Hub thing is right back to share his great ideas with everybody here. And this is going to be a great topic. It's going to be right up both your alleys, both Poujix and Ishaan, because we're going to talk about the topic of innovation as well as creativity. So let's talk about both concepts, what they mean, and how we can actually apply them to our lives. So as always, I'd like to start with Poujix. Poujix, how do you define innovation? What is innovation?
Right. It's essentially you have some basic something, and you make changes to it, such like relatively radical changes, and create a new thing. This could be a object. This could be a concept. This could be anything, and that is what you do with innovation. You build on top of an existing platform.
Oh, on top of an existing platform. So, Ishaan, how do you define innovation?
For me, innovation is anything that has the ability to improve something, or it's something that makes our life easier, or it's something that has the ability to make something, something better in the coming ages. So as Puya mentioned, building on top of something or coming up with something totally original.
Interesting. And how do we compare innovation with creativity exactly? Like, what's the link between the two? Poujix, what's your perspective?
Well, essentially, innovation would be the byproduct of creativity in a sense that, okay, you have some ideas, you make some tweaks here and there, and then you essentially innovate. For example, you have a phone, you put an LCD on it, you put a touch screen on it, and now you have a smartphone.
Wow. So, although I wish it was that simple, by the way.
Idea.
I don't think it was that simple back in the ages when first Steve Jobs made this iPhone thing.
Yeah, well, probably not. The first thing, so the idea that he had was very creative. But then the whole process was an innovative process.
Fantastic. Ishaan, how do you compare creativity as well as innovation?
So I think that innovation comes about when you're actually thinking out of the box, right? Or you come across a solution to something that people have been looking for answers for. And that happens because you're a creative person in the sense that you're thinking differently, right? Mm-hmm. If we all thought the same way, we'll be like a herd of donkeys, right?
That's
right.
And
there will be no innovation happening.
Wow.
So as you said, creativity is like the mother of innovation in that way.
Fantastic. And by the way, it's a mother. Why not a father? Are you a sexist? Answer my question. Why a mother? Why not a father? Why not an uncle? What's the reason? Of course, we're joking here, but the fact of the matter is the origin and the source of all, it's creativity. You want to be creative in order to achieve innovation. So with that being said, guys, let's just be honest here. Are we ourselves necessarily creative or innovative from our perspectives? So Poujix, do you think of yourself as a creative type?
Well, I think everybody is a creative. The question is how creative we are. So it's a spectrum, say from 0 to 100, say. I mean, nobody is on the 0 and nobody's in the 100, but then people differ. So if majority of the population is around the average, say, 30, then if somebody is around 60, like Albert Einstein, or somebody is 80 or whatever, then they stand out as creative types. So essentially everybody is creative. It's just the degree that changes. I think I'm slightly above average. I don't consider myself massively creative, but I do consider myself more than average creative, yes.
Interesting. In which endeavors do you tend to employ your creativity?
Can you repeat that again?
In which area of your life, when you think about different parts of your life, how do you employ your creativity?
As much as possible. I employ it to any aspect of my life as much as possible, and that is especially when I hit a problem. When I hit a problem that I cannot solve in few moments time, it means that it may not be easily solved by conventional ways. So I may have to come up with new ways to solve it. So that would be the time that I immediately actively think about creative ideas.
Interesting.
But then sometimes creative ideas come to you without you even thinking about stuff.
Wow, they come to you without you even thinking.
Especially in dreams, I think. Yeah.
Oh my! So have you had creative ideas in dream?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Most of the
and by dream you mean normal dreams, not like wet dreams or something.
Yeah, normal dreams.
That's right. Very well. Interesting. And let's move on now to Ishaan. Ishaan, do you think of yourself to be creative? Are you an innovative person?
if you were to ask me if I was creative artistically, I'd say I'm below average. Like, I'm pretty bad there. But as Puya mentioned, problem solving, yes, I'd say I'm also above average. And that's something I've come to realize is creativity is expressed in many different ways. It doesn't have to be art, because my definition of creativity as a kid growing up was it has to be artistic. But I realized there are a lot of other ways you can be creative.
Interesting. Like what exactly?
Let's say, I hit a problem. Let's just say something like, let's say I want to park my car, right?
That's
and
right.
There's not enough, there might be some sort of, issues with that. Then coming up with solutions to that, or any other simple problem they come across in life, is creativity, because you're innovating at every second of that problem-solving step.
Interesting. And Poujix earlier mentioned that we all can, we are all somehow creative. The question is how much. So Poujix, do you think creativity is like a fixed trait like IQ, or we could actually work on it and become more creative?
No, I do really believe that we can change the degree. You can even become less creative. And technically, as you grow older, the tendency is actually to become slightly less creative, because you have a very certain rigid way of thinking after a certain point, because you have firm beliefs. As opposed to a kid, for example, because she doesn't have a particular way of thinking, everything is so abstract to them. They're like, okay, whatever. Like, where do babies come from? That's the common question pretty much every child asks. And then because they don't have a particular answer to it, they only imagine stuff, so they're really creative about it.
Wow. I remember asking that question from a friend of mine, or when I was a baby. Man, where do babies come from? The answer would have shocked you if you heard it right now. That's right. Very well.
So the point being, the general tendency is to get less creative as you grow older, but not maybe drastically. But then you can actively improve on it to think about ways to actually develop your creative faculties, let's call them.
Interesting. Yeah. So you believe it's possible to lose your creativity as well as you age. So Ishaan, what is your perspective about being able to develop your level of creativity?
I'm going to bring up a little bit of a biological perspective to it again, if you guys don't mind. It's essentially a mix of nature and nurture. Mm-hmm. So nature is, we are genetically born with some sort of creativity, or like, how we say our IQs and EQs per se. But then nurture, which means the environment that we grow up in, also has a huge role, right? It could be the education system, for example, and studies have shown that sometimes a poor education system can blunt creativity among individuals, right?
Wow.
We're taught to say that there's only one correct answer and one wrong answer, and that kinds of starts reducing the creativity that individuals possess.
Wow. So it all depends on basically both nature as well as nurture. But since here we want to talk about how we can actually boost our creativity and prevent it from basically being vanished as we get older, let's talk about how we can actually boost our creativity, how to think outside of the box and come up with innovative solutions for our problems. So Poujix, what do you think we can do? Like, imagine right now, one of our listeners just tell us that, I am not very creative, neither in arts nor in problem solving, but I want to become more creative. And Ishaan told me that I have it's a combination of genes as well as my upbringing. So I cannot change my genes except for that cool program we had about DNA modification. So wait for 40 years. Hopefully things are going to change after that. But for now, that technology is not available. So what can this person do to become more creative? What do you think? What are your suggestions for such a listener?
Well, right. I mean, it's not really easy within a matter of seconds to give like good ways of actually developing creativity. But in general, if I were to explain what my process is that it depends on how you think rather than your IQ or EQ or whatever. So, it depends on those too, of course. But then, as you mentioned, those are fixed. So we are assuming those are fixed variables that we can't do much about them. So we forget about them and we work with the variables that we have. And what I mean by it depends on the way you think, again, I'm going to get back to the idea of the kid. When sometimes like the way of thinking of the kids surprise us. Oh, where did you get that idea? Like, what made you think like that? And the reason we ask that question of the kid is because we have a certain way of thinking because of the social construct, cultural constructs, and we have basically boundaries to our thinking. And we think, okay, everything is within these norms, etc., etc. And when somebody for various reasons, for any reason, thinks outside of this boundary of norm or its neighborhood drastically, we are shocked. We are like, oh, what's happening? And this is very creative. Or in terms of arts, when somebody creates something that is drastically different than the norm thinks or behaves or sees or hears or whatever, then it's considered very creative. Not necessarily good creative, but still creative. So yeah, essentially it comes down to the way the kid thinks, because it has less boundaries, because it's less defined. And
one question, Poujix, let me just stop you right now for a second. You said we have to think out of the box and then do things that others won't do. What if that process of being creative leads to becoming too creative to the point of being stigmatized by others and being like, this guy is very different, he's weird? What if that creativity actually ends up somehow making us look weird in the eyes of others?
Well, that's very much possible. And the point is, so for example, for myself, when somebody says, okay, this has to be like this, for example, we have to dress like this. So my first tendency, if I'm conformed to the society, my first tendency is like, okay, sure, yeah, everybody there dresses like this. But then I actively ask myself the question of, okay, why? Why do we have to dress like this? And then either it makes sense for some reason, or I reached the conclusion that it's because everybody was doing it since, I don't know, hundreds of years ago. And then, it becomes, okay, so we can dress differently. It's not a must. It's just a, habit rather.
Just one question.
But yeah,
one question. Are you a nudist? Are you a nudist?
No, absolutely not.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Oh my goodness! For a second, that was way too creative for my taste. Way too creative. All right.
Can I add something?
For sure, definitely.
So, like you were saying, how if we get too creative and people perceive us that that guy's weird or something. If we actually look back at some of the greatest innovators in history, they were called weird their whole life, right? So maybe sometimes we shouldn't be afraid in that sense that if we know our ideas can make an impact, like let's just take the example of Elon Musk or Albert Einstein, right? They were called weird their whole life, or dumb, for example. Einstein was called dumb his whole life, but he's obviously one of the smartest guys ever to live on this planet. So
I would never call Elon Musk to be too weird, although what he did on that last podcast, smoking weed on a live podcast, I mean, dude, that's just way too creative. Beyond creative. I mean, I'm telling you, that's just way too much.
Well, he had a puff, though. Like, that's a different question. That's a different conversation. But yeah, okay, cool.
Listen, dude, let us just settle this right now, because I know you're a huge fan of Elon Musk, dude. Come on, this guy is smoking marijuana. The shares of Tesla Motors, the share of all the company, they just collapsed, dude. I mean, what's the point? What point was he trying to make?
No, but I'm gonna ask you this question: why did people think like him actually puffing one puff on that joint would actually affect the way he runs the company? And most importantly, if he didn't do it on,
let me give you the answer right now. Let me give you the first answer.
Sure.
Dude, if this guy cannot hold on to smoking weed in front of friggin' cameras and for a friggin' 30-minute podcast, then how the hell are people going to assume he will not smoke full time when he's in the office or at home?
Okay, so first of all, it was not smoking weed. You got to look at the context. I watched the whole episode. First of all, I was like shocked as well too, because the reports were so shocking. But when you look at it, when you look at actually what happened, it's not really that big of a deal. The podcast host was talking about this joint that he had, which is the weed wrapped in tobacco, and then it was like you probably can't smoke because you're you're a CEO for a public company. And then he's like, but it's legal, right? And it is legal in California, so that's fine. And then he goes on and grabs it, takes a puff. He's like, no, did nothing to me. He didn't even inhale it, based on what you could see at least, and then gave it back. So it's not like he completely dragged the whole joint out.
You're right, but isn't that too creative? I mean, isn't that too creative? Perhaps he could have been a bit more conservative to save the image of the company. I mean, we're right now talking about creativity here, right? Isn't that an example of being too creative to the point of actually sabotaging the very goal that you wanted to be creative with in the first place?
Well, I mean, as if it was because it's on a public podcast, maybe, but in general, I would say no, because there's no harm in one puff, even if it's some sort of poisonous thing, while it's not poisonous with one puff.
One question, Poujix. Okay, you told me earlier you're not a nudist. Are you a weed head?
No, I'm not.
That's very good. Fantastic. Bravo. So now let me just, Ishaan, what is your perspective about, I mean, isn't that an example of being a little bit too creative when Elon Musk smokes weed on a live podcast?
Personally, I would think that's just setting a bad example because he's an inspiration to a lot of people. And the thing with the popular people or big role models is that whatever they do actually inspires a lot of people. So if I were in his place, just because of the fact that they have a greater responsibility to society, just because of the way society thinks of them, it might be wrong. But in the end, it is a personal choice, whatever he would like to do.
But that is true if you consider smoking weed wrong. So, for example, he was also drinking whiskey on that podcast, and nobody talked about it. Because, well, there's a double standard here, right? Because whiskey is completely fine and nobody, it's normal, right?
Dude, I had no idea he was drinking whiskey too. What else was there going on in there? What was happening behind that table? Who was under his table? I gotta know. We gotta check out the videos. Something going on, man.
Look, that's my whole point. This is let me get to the point of it. I don't want to defend him per se for the sake of defending him. If I were him, I would not smoke that weed. Let's put it this way. Because of the very things you said. But again, I want to say how ridiculous this whole conversation has become because, yes, that happened. He talked 2.5 hours from various things, including the possible extinction of human being. And the only thing people talked about that podcast was that 10 seconds, maybe even less, that he briefly puffed on that joint, which actually tells me a lot of things about our society rather than him.
Hold on a second, dude. You're saying he talked about the extinction of humanity on that podcast?
I mean, possibility. Not that humanity would be extinct.
So he talked about the possibility of the extinction of humanity.
Artificial intelligence and all those.
Wow, that's very good. But I don't care, dude. Why did he was smoking?
Yeah.
Why was he smoking, man? Seriously.
Yeah, why was he smoking?
That's
right.
You
gotta ask him.
You're like his agent or something, right? You gotta ask him right now. But joke aside, of course, we're maybe joking here. And quite frankly, I'm a huge fan of Elon Musk. Of course, not as crazy as Poujix, because this guy is just something else. Like he's got posters on. I think he got a tattoo as well or something. And he's like a Tesla, for example, enthusiast and whatever. But for now, I really think of Elon Musk as a very creative and innovative type. I mean, think about this. Like, he takes all of his money and puts it in, this company. I heard, he actually didn't even, live very well. Like, he would take all his money into business.
Yeah, at some point, yeah.
That's a very creative approach to entrepreneurship that he has done, basically. So, joke aside, other than the things the sillies that happen on the podcast, in general, he's a very creative type. But here's the question: why we don't talk about the emotional aspects of creativity? Because I really believe that being creative, it requires a certain degree of courage. I mean, you got to be courageous enough to take a bold step towards something that nobody thinks is done before, right? I mean, this shows how, the very act of Elon Musk smoking marijuana for 10 seconds, I know it's only 10 seconds, so of course it's smoking marijuana, right? Smoking marijuana for 10 seconds on this show. This shows let's use a polite term. This shows the guts of this gentleman, right? This guy's got big guts. I'm telling you, very big guts. So because of this, when you got all this level of courage, for example, when you are so courageous and you're bold enough to take these kind of actions and do that kind of stuff on a podcast, so you definitely will take that kind of risk in your business as well. And I think that's what people are somehow forgetting, is that this gentleman is a risk taker. He's a bold man. This guy got guts, and this guy can do things. Right. So let's talk about that element, because being creative inevitably requires us to do things that we are not sure about, to do things that others are not doing. We could risk being stigmatized. And Ishaan mentioned that many of the top innovators throughout the history have been the people who've been stigmatized and called weird. I mean, we don't like to be somehow stigmatized in society. So what is that factor about? How can we basically focus on building that level of boldness and audacity in order to become more creative?
Ishaan, right?
That's right. First, Ishaan.
Yeah.
So were you just asking how we can become more audacious in terms of innovation?
Of course, because it takes a lot of courage to become creative. I mean, you can risk failure. You can risk being stigmatized. You can risk being isolated from the rest who live differently than you do.
So I would take it this way that, ideas and creativity is, as Puya mentioned, inherent in every human being or animal or whatever you say. But the ability to make it into an innovation requires persistence. And if you're really passionate, or if you think your ideas can make an impact on society, or, you can come up with something that's different, then you got to be persistent and not be afraid of failures. And again, failures is part of life, and we learn from that. But being innovative, being really persistent with what you believe in. Interesting.
Very well. Poujix. Hold on a second, Ishaan. I think you're not done yet. We have lost the connection here. So, Ishaan, you finish your statement.
I add that often means that, just repeat. Just means that it often means that people might think you're weird, or, you get stigmatized. But as I said before, a lot of our heroes that we look up as innovators have gone through that.
Interesting. Ishaan, have you yourself gone through being stigmatized yourself in the process of being a man hub?
Yeah, for sure. Every day, lots of hates and stuff like that.
And how do you deal with that? This is very important to our listeners right now. How do you deal with that pain of being stigmatized? How do you deal with that pain of all the haters who just can't take the dude? This guy is going up all the time. I'm so jealous. How do you deal with that pain? Because it's real.
So you should really, as I say, criticism as two kinds, as constructive and destructive criticism. And you should only care about people that matter to you. There are always going to be a lot of haters, right? But as long as the people around me that matter to me are the ones that are saying something about it, it's when I'll actually notice. Otherwise, it's just letting go of things and sticking to your principles, right? If you believe in something, it's important to stick to those principles.
Would you still stick to your principles if the number of haters, as well as the ones who oppose your ideas, far outnumber the ones who actually support it?
Yeah, if I believe that something is right, and I mean, obviously you look into the moral aspect, and it really depends on the kind of person you are. And if you still believe you're right, then you got to stick to your principles.
Interesting. Very well. So, Poujix, what do you think about that, element of audacity that allows us to be more creative?
I mean, that's literally what it takes for you to stick to your guns when everybody's against you, right? So, and that's exactly what you need. And honestly, eventually it comes down, as Ishaan mentioned, to what you believe. If you believe what you believe, it shouldn't really matter what majority of even say or some say, because obviously it's really your principles, because you can easily change them, right? Otherwise you wouldn't. So, but also if majority of the population goes against what I'm expressing at some point, I would definitely question it. Because there might be a good reason for it, but it wouldn't be it wouldn't be on its own a reason to change my principles. I would look into it, but I may come to the same conclusion, and I would stick to my guns. And I mean, again, it's easier said than done. Hopefully, I would stick to my guns and stick with my beliefs. Yeah.
Very nice. So now we want to go to technical paradigm shift. I first heard this term from Poujix yourself. And before we go to Ishaan, actually, Poujix, would you please explain to me what this terminology actually means? Because I don't have slightest of idea what this actually means.
Right. Well, when we're talking about technological paradigms, there are portions of, in our lives or our technological lives that have significance. For example, internet boom, the internet itself was one of the paradigms, and when we entered the boom of the internet, we entered the paradigm of the internet. So we call that a paradigm shift. So when you move from one paradigm to another, that's called the paradigm shift.
And these paradigms are made with creativity and innovation? These are the results of innovation?
Well, essentially, nobody thought about connecting the whole world through internet until somebody did. And that's the creative way of thinking. That person is like, okay, let's connect the whole world. It's like, why not? It's like, right? At the time that there was no internet, barely there were telephones that really sucked. I mean, at that point, it was absolute creativity and innovation and ideas that was flowing at the time for that whole project. And so that's the thing. When you have technologies that are very significant, like internet, at the beginning of the paradigm, you have a very slow. You can think of it as a exponential curve that eventually slows down, like seemingly would look like an S in English.
That's right.
So initially, your growth is very slow. Like a lot of people don't tend to, conform to the technology. There are some enthusiasts that start off, oh yeah, let's go try out this VR device or something at this point in the life of VR technologies or AR technology, virtual reality and augmented reality. So yeah, I mean, at first there are the ones that are enthusiasts. Beside that, nobody goes after them. So the growth are very slow. The devices don't work that well. They're very expensive. Like you can think of mobile phones initially. They were huge, massive, very heavy. They would hold battery for half an hour. They would be very expensive, and half of the time wouldn't even work. And the only thing they would do if they worked, it was just to make a phone call, and it was very expensive. Eventually, this changes, and it becomes much cheaper. Everybody can buy them now. They last longer. They do a lot of different things, and eventually, as this progress, this S curve that we were talking about, reaches its the late stages, the growth declines. We call this, the technology has reached its maturity, which is what cell phones, smartphones sort of.
So you're saying that smartphone now has reached its maturity in this technology?
In their own paradigm, yes. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be something else. It means that we're going to have another paradigm shift. You can think of, not necessarily, but you can think of the age of cell phones going to smartphones was a paradigm shift, because cell phones have reached their maturity, and now we went on to a new paradigm, being the smartphones.
Interesting. Very good perspective. So now we are undergoing this one, and let me just ask Ishaan about his perspective on the innovations in technology and how they're affecting our lives. Yep. So Ishaan, what do you think about innovation in tech today?
I think it's a very collaborative process now, that there, as has happened in history, but I think it's a lot more collaborative now, where people are just building on each other's work. That's the beauty of innovation, right? So let's say you have an idea X and someone has an idea Y, and that idea Y actually solves what X was trying to build upon. So I think that tech is really moving forward. It was really interesting to hear Poujix talk about the paradigm shift, obviously, but I think that there's still a lot to be achieved in that sense. True that we have, like, let's say we have really good smartphones and whatnot, but I think there's a lot more that can be achieved. For example, tech in the healthcare industry, tech in, artificial intelligence is really starting to boom right now. So I'm pretty excited for that.
Interesting. Very well. You see, Beyond the Present podcast is pretty much a futuristic podcast. So we care a lot about how the future trends are going to be changed. And my last question to both of you guys is about the future of creativity among our people today. I heard that things like social media and television are making our younger generations dumber and dumber day by day. I mean, let's be honest. When think of like a teenager today versus a teenager, for example, who used to live 200 years ago. Nowadays, almost every one of them is on this phone all the time, just scrolling on their Instagram and whatnot. So I want to ask you, Poujix, do you think we are becoming more creative as a species, or becoming less creative and dumber from your perspective?
Well, in general, we are becoming much more smarter, much more brighter. As much as you're correct, and social media is effectively affecting our younger generations, but there are also a portion of the younger generations that are actively getting smarter with the same technologies, not necessarily social media, but then technology itself. You can, even if we go back to the dates, say, before social media and internet, perhaps, you would have a group of people, probably the majority that really didn't care about these, would go about sports, which is a great thing. I have nothing about it, but it doesn't necessarily do anything with your, mathematical intelligence, at least, that you can actually create technologies, come up with stuff like that. If we are talking about it. But then there were some that really cared. At this point, those some that really care wouldn't go much about social media. They would actually go use these technologies to enhance their experience. Even in sports, for example, if a kid wanted to go and play sports and didn't have a leg, he or she couldn't. Now they can get a bionic foot and go about it. And slightly different, but still, it can happen. So of course it has a duality. There's one face of it and the other. One face of it, yes, it's very sad. That's why I don't think of social media as one of the paradigm shifts, although it has been very huge, but it connected people, sure, but beyond that, it doesn't have a great influence.
Interesting. So, Ishaan, what is your perspective? Do you think we as a species are becoming more creative and innovative, or less from your perspective?
I'd say it's a bit of a paradox.
Was that whiskey, by the way? I heard a noise. Was that whiskey?
Yeah,
Come on, buddy. Listen, this is his
goodness.
fault. You see, that's what happens. Elon Musk drinks whiskey and smokes marijuana, and now everybody wants to imitate him. Like, it's just unbelievable, man. Literally. Think about this guy. I'm just
Fuck
kidding.
Elon Musk.
That's right. So, Ishaan, what do you think? You were talking.
I'd say it's a bit of a paradox, like Poujix said, like in the sense that I believe, and I strongly believe that social media is, especially in the age of the teenagers, actually hampering the ability to an extent to think out of the box. And why I say this is because I feel like there's a lot more pressure to actually just be good on your social media, and in turn that actually is hampering even basic communication skills or, the adventurous spirit that a teenager used to have back in the day. And what I meant by that is leave a kid without a phone right now in, let's say, a forest, or let's say an adult, and most of them will get lost because we've kind of lost sense of direction. We can't survive without Google Maps, or we're not used to just sitting down in the summer days and just reading a book because everyone's on their phones.
Unfortunately, that's so true, man. Reading is on a decline, and that really bothers me a lot because of this technologies, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's where I feel like our education system and parents have a huge role to play, especially when growing up, because this is a genetic part of it. The imprinting phase that they say is getting the kids exposed to a lot of other things like books and creative toys and things that stimulate the mind, because that's very important to get your creative juices flowing.
Fantastic.
And if you just hand your kids or teenagers devices, or let's say just put them to gaming the whole day, that's the reason a lot of parents complain that, they're not as active as before. So it's really important to think about this from a genetic perspective too.
And that's just a very good thing from my perspective as well. And I hope that we will use technologies in a constructive way to become more creative in the future. And that's definitely our wish. Unfortunately, we're running out of time here, so let's try to wrap up the show. Poujix, after all that we talked, innovation, creativity, and paradigm shifts and whatnot, what is now your conclusion for our listeners?
So I want to bring up some innovative ideas that is actually going to tie back to our previous episode about artificial intelligence, which essentially with the next paradigm shift, we are going to be moving towards being enhanced species in a sense, meaning that we talked about in the artificial, we're going to have a whole talk about this, but then just to hint on it, we talked about different various versions of artificial intelligence developing. We hinted that there is a secondary thing that we completely ignored, and that is, merging with AIs, which is actually a very creative and innovative idea, because they say if you can't beat it, join it.
Wow.
And we concluded sort of in the past episode that we can't beat artificial intelligence, so we are going to think outside of the box. So we're not going to beat it. We're going to join it.
Wow. We're going to become it. That's going to be amazing. Think of it like you put that stuff inside of your body.
Become it, yeah.
You, I think, talk about singularity, right?
Yeah, sort of.
Fantastic. Bravo. Ishaan, what is your conclusion after all that we talked today?
I'd say innovation is really exciting. I look forward to a lot of collaborations in general among the whole world. And I think the more collaborative and more ideas that flow, positive ideas, I think we can be excited for what's coming ahead in the future, if that's what we're looking at.
Fantastic. A great show full of content. I loved it so much, and I definitely send my thoughts and prayers definitely go to Elon Musk for his wonderful behavior. We just had one of our guests here today drinking whiskey and doing marijuana on the show. Pretty amazing example to follow. Of course, we're getting here, and that's all the time we have for. Are you right now listening to BTP on Explorer somewhere? Are you literally using the link we give you on social media? Come on, guys, stop it right now. Just download the podcast app on iOS devices, as well as the Google Play, basically for your Android devices, and start listening to our podcast as soon as they're made available by simply subscribing to them. So if you're not subscribed, please do so right now. This is all the time we have for. My name is Daniel Mulligan, and this was Beyond the Present Podcast. Thank you.